The pastor came to church that morning to preach forgiveness, and by noon he had a mafia boss in handcuffs outside his café. Seok-jin stood in the courtyard of the little community café with his wrists crossed behind his back, watching the pastor who had called the police on him. Elias Carter was a broad-shouldered American with gray at his temples and a steadiness in his voice that came from years behind a pulpit. He met Seok-jin's stare and did not flinch. "I warned you," Elias said. "This block belongs to the families who live here, not to you and not to your business." Seok-jin said nothing. There was nothing to confess, and they both knew it. A noise complaint, a property line, a young man with powerful enemies and a careful lawyer. He'd be out before the tea in his office went cold. Still, he let them walk him to the car. He had learned long ago that the calmest man in any room is the one holding all the cards. The station smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. They sat him on a bench while an officer typed with 2 slow fingers. And that was when he saw her. She came through the glass doors with a paper bag and a thermos, searching for her father, and the whole gray room seemed to tilt toward the doorway. Golden brown skin, a soft cloud of curls pinned back off her face, a coat far too thin for the cold. She found Elias first, pressed the thermos into his hands, and said something that softened the hard line of his mouth. Then she turned, and her eyes landed on Seok-jin. She didn't look away the way people always did. She didn't go pale or drop her gaze. She looked at him the way you'd look at someone who'd had a long, miserable day. "You look cold," she said. And before anyone could stop her, she crossed the floor and set her own untouched cup down on the bench beside him. "Ginger tea. It helps." "Naomi." Her father's voice cut sharp across the room. "He's a person, Dad." She straightened, unbothered. Whatever he did. Seok-jin looked at the paper cup, then up at her. In his world, people brought him things out of fear, out of debt, out of wanting something back. No one had ever simply handed him a little warmth and walked away expecting nothing at all. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. She gave a small nod and returned to her father, and he watched the doors long after they'd swallowed her. An hour later they let him go, exactly as he'd known they would. His lawyer was already on the phone, his men already waiting at the curb. But for the first time in years, none of it held his attention. Only a thin coat, a cup of ginger tea, and a name he had no business repeating. Naomi. Men like Seok-jin did not go to church, which was exactly why no one in the small congregation recognized the danger sitting in the back pew. He told himself he came for information. A man in his position kept track of everyone who crossed him, and Pastor Elias Carter had crossed him in front of an entire district. That was the reason. That was the only reason. He repeated it to himself as he slid into the last row of folding chairs, in a plain dark coat with no men at his back. And then she walked up to the front to read the morning scripture, and the reason fell apart in his hands. Naomi stood at the small wooden podium in a yellow dress, sunlight from the window catching the curve of her cheek. Her voice was unhurried, a little nervous, warm in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She read about a shepherd leaving 99 sheep to chase the one that wandered off. And Seok-jin, who had spent his whole life being the kind of thing shepherds warned their flocks about, found he couldn't look anywhere else. She saw him halfway through. He watched her lose her place, recover, and finish with her eyes flicking back to his more than once. Afterward, the congregation spilled into the courtyard for tea and rice cakes. He should have left. Instead, he let the crowd carry him toward the table where she was stacking paper cups. "The man from the police station," she said, not looking up. "You came to church. I was curious what kind of place arrests people on a Tuesday and feeds them on a Sunday." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. She handed him a cup. "My father isn't usually the arresting type. You must have earned it." "I usually do." She finally looked at him then, really looked, and something passed between them that made the noise of the courtyard go distant. He noticed everything at once: the small gold cross at her throat, the ink stain on her thumb, the way she leaned in half a step as if she'd decided to trust him before her sense could object. What she didn't notice was the man near the gate. Seok-jin had clocked him the moment he stepped into the courtyard, one of Jang Min-ki's people, loitering, watching the pastor's daughter a beat too long, photographing the building. A message, dressed up as a churchgoer. Naomi never saw him. She would never know that Seok-jin caught the man's eye across the courtyard and held it until the man understood precisely whose attention he had drawn, and left without a word. When Seok-jin turned back, she was offering him a rice cake, oblivious to all of it. "You should come back next Sunday," she said. He should not. He knew, with the same certainty he brought to every dangerous decision, that nothing good waited at the end of this. "I will," he said, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. Naomi found out the church café was being forced to close on a Thursday, and the man who saved it was the last person her father would ever have chosen. The notice came from a property holding company nobody could quite trace. Rent tripled overnight, a list of violations invented out of thin air, a deadline that gave them 2 weeks to clear out. Elias spent the morning on the phone with lawyers who all said the same thing in different words. Someone wanted them gone, and that someone had money. Naomi watched her father's shoulders fold inward for the first time in her life, and felt something in her chest go cold. Seok-jin already knew the name behind it: Jang Min-ki, an older man from his own world who wanted Seok-jin pulled back into the bloodier business he'd been trying to leave, and had figured out that the pastor's block was the pressure point. Squeeze the church, squeeze Seok-jin's strange new weakness. Watch what he'd give up to protect it. So Seok-jin bought the building, quietly, through 3 layers of paper, and then handed the deed to the holding company's throat until the rent dropped back to what it had been and the violations vanished. He told Elias only that he'd spoken to the owners. He told Naomi nothing at all. He just started being there, fixing the cafe's broken window latch, carrying crates of hymnals, standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed while she taught the children's Sunday class. Close enough that she felt watched in a way that wasn't frightening so much as it was electric. It was during one of those afternoons that Jun-pyo cornered her. The young deacon was handsome in a polished, approved-of way, the kind of man her father kept seating beside her at dinner. He leaned on the counter and turned his smile up. "Your father thinks we'd suit each other," he said. "I think he's right." Naomi opened her mouth to be polite. She didn't get the chance. Seok-jin was simply there, setting a stack of chairs down hard enough to make Jun-pyo step back, his voice perfectly even. "She's working." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Jun-pyo looked at his face, found something in it he didn't want to test, and left. "That was rude," Naomi said, but she was fighting a smile. "He was in your way." "And what are you?" He didn't answer with words. He crossed the space between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back. And when she didn't, when she lifted her chin instead, he cupped her jaw in one hand and kissed her. It was nothing like she'd imagined a first kiss would be. He kissed her like he'd been holding his breath since the police station, careful and certain all at once, and she gripped the front of his coat to keep the floor where it belonged. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "That," he said quietly, "is what I am." Naomi had been kissing a man for 3 weeks before she learned his full name from a newspaper, and the photograph beneath it was a mugshot. Jun Pyo brought it to her father, of course. Wounded pride makes a thorough investigator. He spread the printouts across the cafe table one evening after closing. Court filings, old headlines, a grainy photo of Seok-jin outside a building that had burned years ago. The word organization appeared again and again, dressed in legal language that meant only one thing. Elias read every page in silence, while Naomi stood frozen by the counter. And when he finally looked up, his face held a grief that was worse than anger. "You knew," he said. "You knew what he was." "I knew who he was to me." Her voice shook. "That's not the same thing." It was the wrong answer. She knew it the moment she said it. Seok-jin arrived for their Sunday window latch routine to find Elias waiting alone in the empty sanctuary. The printouts fanned across the front pew like an accusation. He didn't pretend not to understand. He'd known this conversation would come. He'd simply hoped to be a different man by the time it did. "Is it true?" Elias asked. "Most of it." Seok-jin's voice was steady. "Not all. I've spent 2 years trying to leave that life. I bought your building. I made the threats against it disappear. I never lied to your daughter about a single thing I felt. But you let her fall for a man you knew you couldn't be." Elias stood slowly. He wasn't a violent man. He didn't have to be. "I have spent my whole life pulling people out of the kind of darkness you come from. I have buried boys her age because of men like you. And you want me to hand you my child?" Seok-jin had no answer, because it wasn't an unfair thing to say. "Stay away from Naomi." Elias's voice cracked on her name. "If you love her even a little, you'll let her have an ordinary life. You'll let her be safe. That's the one thing a man like you can give her that's worth anything." Naomi found out the next morning that Seok-jin was gone. No message, no men outside the cafe. The window latch he'd been fixing sat half-finished, and that small, unfinished thing undid her more than any goodbye could have. She sat on the cafe floor with her back against the counter and cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was a child, while her father stood helpless in the doorway, certain he had saved her, and unable to bear the sound. What none of them knew yet was that Jangmin Ki had been waiting for exactly this, for the pastor to do his work for him, for Seok-jin to walk away undefended, for the one thing the young boss loved to be left standing in the open, with no one watching her at all. Jangmin Ki didn't kidnap Naomi so much as invite her to tea, which was somehow more frightening once she understood she couldn't leave. He'd sent a car to the cafe with a driver who knew her father's name, a message about a donation for the church, an address that turned out to be a private dining room above a quiet restaurant. By the time Naomi realized the doors stayed closed when she reached for them, the polite older man across the table had already set down his cup and folded his hands. "You're not in danger," Min-ki said pleasantly. "Your letter. I'm simply waiting for it to be read by the person it's addressed to." That person was already coming. Min-ki had counted on it. Seok-jin arrived without a single man behind him, which was the first thing that made Min-ki uneasy. He'd expected a war. Instead, the younger man walked in alone, looked at Naomi long enough to confirm she was unharmed, and then set a thick folder on the table between them. "Deeds," Seok-jin said. "Every property, every account, every piece of the business you've been trying to drag me back into. It's yours, all of it. Signed over this morning." He pushed it across. "You wanted me back in the life because I was useful to you. I'm giving you everything that made me useful. There's nothing left to pull on." Min-ki stared at the folder. "You'd hand it all to me. For her." "I'd hand it to anyone. She's just the reason I finally did." Seok-jin's voice didn't rise. "You built your whole plan on the idea that I'd fight you for power. I'm not going to fight you. I'm going to walk out of that life and leave you holding all of it, and every enemy that comes with it. Keep the kingdom, Min-ki. I'm keeping her." There was no leverage left in a man who'd already given everything away. Min-ki understood it the way an old gambler understands a folded hand. He waved one tired hand at the door, almost amused, and let them go. Outside, the night air hit Naomi like cold water. She turned on him in the empty street, furious and shaking. "You disappeared. You let my father send you away. You didn't even fight for—" "I'm done fighting." He caught her face in both hands. "I gave it all away an hour ago. The business, the buildings, the name everyone's afraid of, gone. I don't want to be the man your father warned you about. I want to be the man who fixes your window latch on Sundays." His thumbs brushed her cheekbones. "I love you. Not the way men in my old world said it. The ordinary way. The forever way." She kissed him before he finished, rising onto her toes, gripping his collar, the fear of the night dissolving into the warmth of his mouth on hers. "Then come home," she whispered against his lips, "and tell my father everything. All of it." It took a former Mafia boss exactly 1 month of fixing window latches, stacking hymnals, and saying nothing about it to earn back the trust of the man who'd had him arrested. Seok-jin had told Elias everything that first night. The folder, the deeds, the empire signed away. Min-ki left holding all of it. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He simply kept showing up. He drove the church van when it wouldn't start. He sat in the back pew every Sunday and learned the hymns badly and on purpose, so Naomi could laugh at him for it. He let the pastor watch him become an ordinary man in real time, with no kingdom to retreat to and nothing left to prove except the one thing that couldn't be bought. Elias was a man who had built his life on the belief that people could change. It would have made him a hypocrite to refuse the proof of it, standing in his own sanctuary every week. He gave his blessing on a gray afternoon over cold coffee. "I warned you to leave her alone because I thought you couldn't be anything but what you were," he said. "I was wrong about that. I'm man enough to say so." He held out his hand. "Take care of my daughter, or you'll find out I can have you arrested twice." Seok-jin shook it and almost smiled. They married in the spring, in the little church with the broken latch he had finally fixed for good. Naomi wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist, a crown of white flowers in her curls, and walked down the aisle on her father's arm, to a man who had given away an empire just to be allowed to stand at the front of a room and wait for her. Elias performed the ceremony himself. His voice held steady until the vows, and then it didn't, and no one minded. When he said the words that made them husband and wife, the small congregation of café regulars and Sunday children erupted into applause. Seok-jin didn't wait for permission. He drew Naomi in by the waist and kissed her the way he'd kissed her that first time against the café counter, careful and certain and entirely undone by her, and she laughed against his mouth and kissed him back until her father cleared his throat and the whole room laughed with them. They didn't run from anything after that. There was no shadow at the edge of the courtyard, no name left to fear, no enemy waiting for a chance. Min-ki had his kingdom and his troubles, and no further interest in a man who owned nothing he wanted. Seok-jin had a window latch to maintain, a wife who poured him ginger tea on cold mornings, and a pew at the back of a church that had somehow become the only place he'd ever felt at home. The most feared man in the district had wanted only one thing in the end. And on a bright spring morning, with her hand in his, he finally had it.